Welcome back, everyone, to the Deep Dive. You know, we love to really get into the weeds on big stories, and, well, today's a doozy. We're going to be talking about President Trump's plan to put some big auto tariffs into place, and we're going right to the source for this one.
Yeah, going straight to the president's remarks should be fascinating to get a sense of, the thinking behind it all. This
Yeah,
is a policy that could have some pretty wide-reaching effects on the auto industry and well beyond.
absolutely. So let's get into it. The big news here is that the president announced a 25% tariff on all cars coming into the U.S.
All cars not made here.
Right, all imported cars that are not manufactured in the United States.
And this is
And this is going into effect on April 2nd.
April 2nd.
Right. And to be clear, this new tariff is on top of the 2.5% tariff that's already in place. So this is a big increase for foreign-made vehicles.
It is, and it's a pretty clear signal, right? The president said if they're made in the United States, there's absolutely no tariff. So
Right.
there's a really strong incentive in place here.
Yeah, it's a big incentive. Um, and the reasons behind this, as the president laid them out, there are a few core ideas. He really wants to bring car manufacturing back to America. He talked about it being a liberation day in America and taking back money that he believes we've lost to other countries.
That's right. And that kind of language really taps into that long-running debate about American manufacturing and the importance for our economy and jobs.
Right, bringing those jobs back.
Yeah, and framing it as a liberation too is interesting. It really emphasizes this idea that this is a big change, a decisive shift in trade policy.
A turning point.
Yeah.
He also explicitly stated that this is meant to, help the American auto industry itself to grow.
Hmm.
And a big part of that, of course, is that tariff exemption for domestically produced cars.
Right. It's a pretty
Yeah.
direct approach.
It is, it is. And, the potential consequences, or at least what the president laid out, were pretty ambitious. He thinks companies are going to start building tons of new manufacturing plants here in the U.S. He even talked about them, making their own power and getting permits much quicker, just getting these facilities up and running as fast as possible.
Yeah, and he seemed pretty optimistic about that, right? Talking about billions and billions of dollars in investments in each of these plants.
Yeah, huge investments.
And he also pointed out that foreign car companies that already have some plants here,
Right, they're already here.
they're already here, maybe not running at full steam.
Yeah, not 100%.
Right. They could ramp up production to meet demand and avoid the tariffs.
Makes sense.
And if we zoom out for a second, it's not just about attracting new companies, right? It's
Uh-huh.
about encouraging the ones that are already here to double down to invest more heavily in U.S. production. So this could have some ripple effects on, existing supply chains and things like that.
Yeah, that's a good point. And the potential revenue from these tariffs, that was a big focus. His representative talked about over $100 billion annually coming in from this,
100 billion.
and even more in the long term, maybe $600 billion to $1 trillion within a couple of years. So, I mean, those are huge numbers. It makes you wonder, what are those numbers based on?
That's the key question, right? I mean, those are projections.
Right, projections, not guarantees.
Exactly. And the actual revenue, oh, well, it'll depend on a lot of different things. How many manufacturers decide to eat that tariff cost? How many will move production to the U.S.? And then, of course, how much will people be willing to pay for imported cars if the prices go up? Predicting that is, not an exact science.
Yeah, there are a lot of moving pieces.
Yeah.
Now, the president also said this will create a lot of jobs, which makes sense, both in construction to build these new plants, but also, of course, in the auto industry itself to work in them.
That's a core benefit, right? American jobs tied directly to these tariffs. It's a really tangible outcome that I think resonates with a lot of people.
Yeah, for sure.
Now, here's an interesting comparison that the president made.
Mm.
He talked about the CEGS Act,
Right.
and he actually called it a disaster. He said it was a disaster because it gave money to chip companies without requiring them to build their factories here. And he used the example of that Taiwanese chip maker that's making this huge investment in Arizona. His point was that they're only doing that because they have to produce domestically to serve the U.S. market.
So he's saying he prefers the stick to the carrot.
Yeah, basically.
Yeah.
Using access to the market as leverage instead of giving out direct financial incentives. I think it raises an interesting question, though.
What's that?
Will you know which strategy is going to be more effective? And are there downsides to this kind of stick approach?
Yeah, it's a good question. And this isn't just about cars either. The president was clear that he's thinking about doing similar things in other industries like pharmaceutical,
Pharmaceutical.
lumber, all kinds of things. And again, the
Yeah.
goal is to get more stuff made here in America.
Yeah.
He even pointed to the tariffs that are already in place on steel and aluminum, saying they were a big success and helped revitalize those industries.
Right.
But I'm curious,
Yeah.
aside from that revitalization, have there been any other consequences of those tariffs? Things we should be thinking about.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I mean, supporters will point to increased production and more jobs in those industries.
Right, makes sense.
But critics will say that it's hurt industries that rely on steel and aluminum.
Oh, right. It costs them more.
Exactly. It drives their costs up. And then ultimately that can mean higher prices for consumers. So it's rarely a simple win-win situation.
Yeah, there's always a trade-off. Now, this part is really interesting, especially for anyone thinking about buying a new car.
Right.
There's a tax deduction being proposed. And I say proposed because it's not a done deal yet. But this deduction would be for the interest payments on car loans.
Hmm.
But here's the catch. You only get this deduction if you buy a car that was made in America.
So another incentive aimed right at the consumer.
Exactly. It's like they're trying to make American-made cars more appealing by making them cheaper to finance.
Right. And it could be pretty powerful, depending on how big that deduction is and whether people even know about it.
Yeah, that's a good point. Now, the president was asked about potential loopholes. Could companies try to get around this?
Yeah.
Someone asked specifically about foreign automakers shipping cars without certain parts like tires to try to avoid the full tariff.
Right.
And the president said, well, they're going to be very strongly policing this, and basically they expect most cars to be made in one place to keep things simple.
But that raises some practical questions, right?
What?
Well, I mean, how do you even define what a car made in America really is? And then there's a whole issue of monitoring all of that across these incredibly complex global supply chains, making sure companies aren't finding ways to cheat the system. You're going to need really clear rules and strong enforcement to make that work.
Yeah, it sounds tricky. And of course, the big question is, will all of this mean higher prices for us, the consumers? I mean, that's usually what happens with tariffs, right?
Right.
The president said he thinks we're going to see a market unlike anything we've ever seen before, and this policy is something he's wanted to do for a long time, and that it's going to benefit the United States. But what does economics tell us about what usually happens when you put tariffs in place?
Well, typically tariffs make imported goods more expensive. And while the president is saying that more production here will offset that, basic economics suggests that consumers end up paying at least some of that extra cost. How much really depends on whether there are American-made alternatives and how companies decide to price their products.
Right. A lot of factors to consider. So to be clear about the timeline, these auto tariffs are going into effect on April 2nd.
Right.
And they'll start collecting those tariffs the very next day, April 3rd.
Wow, that's fast.
It is. And he also said there aren't any other new tariffs planned for other industries on that specific date, other than the lumber tariffs, which we've talked about before.
So the focus is on the auto industry right now, but it sounds like other sectors could be next, depending on how this all plays out.
Right. The door is open. Now, he also mentioned something called reciprocal tariffs. And he said he's going to announce those the week after, around April 2nd. But he said they'll be very lenient and maybe even lower than what other countries have been putting on us.
Interesting. I wonder what the strategy is there.
Yeah. What do you make of that?
Well, it could be a way to, take a strong stance initially, but also show that they're open to more balanced trade in the future. But we'll have to see what lenient actually means in practice. It could be a way to head off any retaliation from other countries.
Yeah. Try to keep things from escalating.
Exactly.
So naturally, everyone wants to know how the big American car companies feel about this.
Right.
The president said that the ones with big factories here in the U.S. are thrilled. And that makes sense. They'll save a lot of money. But he also said that companies that don't have much production in the U.S., well, they'll probably have to start building here if they want to avoid those tariffs. He even said he thinks companies like General Motors might move their parts divisions back to the U.S.
Wow. So this is about more than just where the cars are assembled.
It is.
It's about the whole supply chain, the entire ecosystem. They want it all to be more American-made.
Yep, that's the goal. And then there's Tesla, of course. They make a lot of cars here already. Big plants in Texas and California. And someone asked if this would be good for Tesla. The president basically said, yeah, it probably would be neutral or even good because they already manufacture so much here.
Right. They're in a good position because they won't have to pay those extra costs on imports. So that could give them an advantage over their competitors here.
Yeah, potentially.
Yeah.
And finally, someone asked if he talked to Elon Musk about all of this, and he said no because of potential conflicts of interest.
Makes sense. It's important to keep policy decisions separate from individual business interests. You don't want to create any appearance of favoritism.
Yeah, absolutely. So to recap, the big story here is a 25% tariff on imported cars starting April 2nd. And it's a huge incentive for car companies all over the world to start making their cars here in the U.S. The administration thinks this will bring in a lot of money, create jobs, and it's a different approach than, say, the THPS Act. We're also seeing a bigger push to use tariffs across the board, and there's this idea of a tax break for people who buy American-made cars. And while there will be some reciprocal tariffs coming soon, the immediate focus is on these auto tariffs.
It's a bold move for sure. The whole idea is to use tariffs to change where things are manufactured to strengthen American industry, especially the auto industry, and ultimately to reduce our trade deficit.
So here's a question for you, our listener. Think big picture here. How do you think this is going to change the global auto industry in the long run? We're talking about a major economic power basically saying we're going to make it a lot more expensive to import cars. What could be some of the unintended consequences of this big shift in trade policy?
Yeah, that's worth thinking about. Think about where cars are made, yes, but also think about what it could mean for innovation, for the competitiveness of the American auto industry, and how will other countries that made a lot of cars react? There are a lot of interconnected pieces here, and things could go in unexpected directions.
Absolutely. This is a complex issue, and the implications go way beyond just how much a new car costs. We encourage you to keep learning about international trade, to look at this from different angles and really think about how these policies might affect industries and ultimately your life as a consumer.
Yeah, it's a story worth following.
It is. Thanks for joining us for the deep dive.
See you next time.
See ya.